Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, I'm going to talk quickly about my appearance on the EN World podcast talking about the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. We're going to look at the huge Pathfinder 2E Humble Bundle going on. The Phantasy Star RPG is now available for pre-order. Level Up Advanced 5E's Monstrous Menagerie 2 is available on Kickstarting. Today we have two big topics. One is the hard truths about crowdfunding RPG products from a GM's perspective. How does it matter for you? This is a fun topic we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to talk about the top advice offered on page 1 of the new 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. Is it good? We'll find out. And we're going to cover questions from the November 2024 Patreon Q&A all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, here to talk about all things in tabletop role-playing games. The Lazy RPG Talk Show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to all kinds of tips, tricks, tools, source books, scenarios, adventures, and stuff to help you run your fantasy role-playing games. You also get access to the awesome Lazy GM community over on Discord, and you help me put on shows like this. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your outstanding support. So the one nice thing about Wizards of the Coast putting out a new Dungeon Master's Guide is it gives me tons of material to talk about, because there's been one of these in 10 years, right? It's 10 years between them. And when they put one out, there's so much stuff to kind of dive into and talk about and look at that it makes it easy for me to have lots of interesting things to talk about. And that is certainly not in the context of like, let's just go bash the Dungeon Master's Guide. There are criticisms that I think are worthy, and there are praise that I think are worthy. And we're going to talk about, today's a fair bit of praise. We're going to talk mostly about praise today. But if you want to hear me do kind of like my first cursory full, it's not even like a deep dive, but kind of like covering a lot of it. I had the privilege of being on the EN World podcast. This is Morrus's Unofficial Tabletop podcast. And I was able to talk with Jessica and PJ and Morrus about the Dungeon Master's Guide. I was the only one that was on the list that had it and read it yet. So they asked me lots of questions and I answered them. So if you want to get like an hour-long discussion from me about the Dungeon Master's Guide overall, that is the best place to do it. Because I don't think I'm not going to be doing a full hour-long deep dive in the Dungeon Master's Guide here. Instead, I'm going to pick particular topics like I did last week with encounter building, like I am this week with the top advice that they have for game masters in the earliest parts of the book. I'm going to be covering it like that, little bits and pieces as we go. And I'm going to be comparing it to other sources and some of my own stuff that I've been doing as we go. But if you want to hear about it, please check out that podcast. That's a great way to do it. Pathfinder 2, the second biggest RPG, has a huge... I've actually been waiting for this. I do not play Pathfinder. I have played it a couple of times. It's a little crunchy for me, but I wanted it. I wanted to have the new books. I wanted to see what they were like. I like to have them in my library so that when I'm studying RPGs overall, I can look at that one in particular. And it's just cool. So I've been waiting, but I didn't want to pay for the full price of the thing, knowing that it was mostly going to sit on my hard drive and gather space. So I've been waiting for a Humble Bundle because I know that they have worked with Humble Bundle before, and they have done a Humble Bundle now. So you can get the Pathfinder Humble Bundle, $30 for 72 different items, including all of the core books for Pathfinder 2E, the GM Core, the Bestiary 1, 2, and 3, and the GM Core, the Player Core. They're kind of out of order here. The GM Core, the Player Core, and 3 Bestiaries alone for $30 is already a good deal. But then there's also a complete like Pathfinder organized play path. I haven't even looked at these. Monsters of Myth, the Pathfinder Society Guide, tons of different things, and then a whole pile of the digital versions of their flip mats. So if you're looking for a bunch of VTT compatible flip mats or VTT compatible like dungeons and layouts and full colored displays, you can, when you pick this up, you will have a ton of virtual tabletop displays in there. Here's the Player Core book, by the way. So lots of adventures going on here, lots of stuff. I'll be honest, like I didn't even really look at anything other than the core books because the core books is the main reason that I wanted to jump on. But there is a lot of value in this. For $30, it is a steal. And today when we're going to be talking about crowdfunding campaigns and things like that, when it comes to the world of tabletop RPGs, there are areas where you get really good deals and areas where you might not get really good deals. The various humble bundles and bundles of holding dollar per pound are by far the best values that you get in TTRPGs. You often get this. I mean, in this case, you're literally getting 50 cents a product for some of these. And maybe you're not going to use all those products, right? Maybe you're going to be like, I don't really need the VTT mats, and somebody says like, oh, when you say a VTT compatible flip mat, do you mean a JPEG? Yes, I mean a JPEG. Yeah, that's definitely true. So, the value of different books, but certainly for, just the 5 core books alone for $30 is a crazy good deal. So if you are at all interested in peeking in at the world of Pathfinder 2nd edition, you don't have the digital versions of these products, this is probably the cheapest way you're going to be able to get them, along with a lot of other material. Really, really fantastic deal on this bundle if you're interested in peeking your head at Pathfinder 2e, the latest version of Pathfinder 2e. My friend Rich Lescaflair has been working with Sega on the Phantasy Star tabletop role-playing game. Rich Lescaflair already has the awesome science fiction RPG known as Esper Genesis. It's already out and available. And he got the license from Sega to make a Phantasy Star tabletop role-playing game. One of the issues with that license is he cannot crowdfund it. So there's no Kickstarter or backer kit or other kind of way that he can crowdfund the project. But he did put it up for pre-order. And with the pre-order, you get the full physical version of the book and the PDF of the book available to you. You receive the free copy of the book as soon as your order ships. It's expected to come out in summer 2025. Really cool artwork, awesome stuff. And Rich is a fantastic designer. So really interesting stuff. If you are a fan of Phantasy Star, I played Phantasy Star when I was a wee lad and really loved it. I cried. I remember when Nay, one of the characters, died, spoiler, and I cried. So really cool stuff. And if you are interested in Phantasy Star, it is a 5e based game, so you will be familiar with the rule set underneath it. And it looks really, really cool. But you can check that out on the Phantasy Star tabletop role-playing game pre-order page. The Level Up Advanced 5e Monstrous Menagerie 2 is now available on Kickstarter. The Monstrous Menagerie, to this day, remains my favorite monster book for D&D, for 5e. I really like the Tales of the Valiant Monster Vault, but there's a few things that the Monstrous Menagerie has that the Vault doesn't have, like treasure parcels per monster and things like that I think kind of edge it over the top a bit. The design, one could argue about the monster design between one book and the other, and with which one you want. I am using the Monster Vault, for example, in my Tales of the Valiant game, so it's an outstanding book. I don't want to knock it. I also wrote the encounter building guidelines for it, so of course I'm not going to knock my own book. But I really love the Monstrous Menagerie, and now they have a new Monstrous Menagerie 2 available on Kickstarter. So you can check this out. It's in the show notes. One thing to note, I do have a monster. They had already commissioned a monster. I've already delivered that monster. I've already been paid for it. So I am one of the writers of material in this book. I have one monster, a cool sort of a warlock wight. I felt like there was an undead... A need for undead spellcaster type monsters. So you will find that in here. So looks really cool. I, of course, absolutely wanted to back it and did back it, and I'm excited to pick that up. That is the Monstrous Menagerie 2 by Level Up Advanced 5e, available for your 5e games as well. Links to that are in the show notes. We just talked about the Monstrous Menagerie. We talked about the pre-order for Phantasy Star RPG. We talked about the Pathfinder 2e Humble Bundle. I've talked every week on this show. I usually bring up one or two different crowdfunding campaigns or other things like that. But there are some hard truths that we need to face, you and I, as we sit down and think about this hobby. When we are looking at the incredible wealth of products that are coming out for tabletop role-playing games. And I think there's a couple of little danger zones. And I think it's very possible that I am promoting some of these danger zones. And I wanted to talk about that a bit. And I wanted to kind of clarify some things about the hard truths of crowdfunded RPG products. So here are some hard truths, right? Things about this that I think are really important. Crowdfunding for role-playing games has been absolutely outstanding for the hobby. Now that it's been around since the earliest days, where games like Numenera became an entire line of games because of the money they were able to bring in from Kickstarter, it brings us a tremendous range of systems, supplements, and accessories that allows us to enjoy our games. And these are systems and supplements and accessories that would not exist at all if it wasn't for crowdfunding. That's a critical component of it. So the incredible wealth of RPGs that we have, and supplements for those RPGs, and accessories to run those RPGs, all of that stuff A lot of it owes its value to the fact that people can basically test the waters and see if people are interested in a product and back those products. At the same time, for many of us, and myself included by a long shot, a lot of the RPG products that I buy, I don't use at the table. I don't really need them. And in many cases, even if they're cool, I might not use them. Even if I like the ideas, even if they're gorgeous products, really cool ideas, lots of stuff going on. The truth is, I only have so much room at my table for any kind of material. And a lot of the stuff gets unused. That's absolutely true. Crowdfunding absolutely helps creators become small businesses and helps those small businesses survive year to year. So I'm going back and forth between like the good, the bad, the good, the bad, right? And the truth is that like a lot of companies would not be able to scale to the size that they scaled to or be able to keep it up if they weren't using crowdfunding campaigns to support their work. So if you like having small businesses run by creators who truly love this hobby and you want to see them thrive, crowdfunding campaigns are a great way to help them thrive. I could name a dozen companies off the top of my head that might not be anything at all. Again, I'm going to pick on Monty Cook Games because of Numenera. When they were first doing Numenera, he said, I wasn't sure if it wasn't going to be like a 16-page black and white pamphlet. And instead, it's this huge line of gorgeous full-color books for that system. And it's because of crowdfunding. It was because of the ability for them to bring in revenue for products that didn't yet exist. So it is a really big boon to those small businesses to be able to do that. And hard truth number 4, crowdfunding can create FOMO, the fear of missing out, from those who cannot afford to pick up the stuff that we're talking about, that I talk about when I talk about crowdfunding campaigns. I am extremely lucky, both as a small business a small business owner of myself. My wife and I own our business here, and it's a successful RPG business, that we have an allowance for this stuff. And I talk about it on this show and I bring it up, which means not only is it an allowance, it's a business expense. So it's tax deductible for me to be able to pick this stuff up. That's a huge savings that I get that most people don't get. But even being able to afford this stuff, even with that break, I'm very lucky to be in that position where I can afford a lot of this stuff and try it out. Now, I look at these from the state of a GM. Is this a useful product for GMs? Is this the kind of thing I think could be valuable to your game? And that's what I really base it on. A lot of it is like, does this speak to me? Like, does this product sound cool to me? It's like something I like and I would want and I would use. Do I think it's something valuable to GMs? And that's what makes me determine whether or not I'm going to talk about it on this show. I wouldn't talk about it, and I don't talk about products. I get many, many dozens of pitches every week, and I only usually do a couple. And they're usually from people I know for products that I'm aware of already, because those are the kinds of ones that I want to promote. But I know that by talking about all of these different things, that there are people who are like, look, I can only afford 1 or 2 books a year, or maybe 3 or 4 books a year. I can't really afford a lot of this stuff. And I hear about all this cool stuff. I've got good news for you. But the reality is that like it creates FOMO. The other aspect is for those of us who do buy a lot of RPG products and don't use them at our table, there's a possibility we feel bad about having wasted our money on it. And that's something else that we can dive into. And you're going to have to decide how you feel about it. But what I'm going to try to do here, you as a GM, right? I am presuming that when I'm talking to you, I'm talking to a game master who's out there, who's running fantasy RPGs, and hears me talk about these supplements and learns about these other ones, and would like some thoughts about how for each of us to guide how we think about purchasing all these products or what we do with them. And I'm hoping that we can get to good places of equilibrium where we are happy with our state and how we do things either way. So, what can you do? If you have the means and you get excited about products that you see and you back them, go with the gods. That's what I do, right? I get excited about products. I have the budget to be able to afford to buy these products. I get excited for them and I buy them. Some of them I talk about here in the show. And that's fine. And nobody, I don't need permission or approval from anyone else other than my wife, right? About this whole business, right? I get to decide what I want to do with it. If you don't have the means to pick up these things, and you hear me talk about things like the Phantasy Star RPG or the Monstrous Menagerie 2, and you're like, man, I would love to get that Monstrous Menagerie 2, but I can't afford it, right? Times are hard, times are tight. This is just a small hobby for me. I don't have any other income that I can just, apply to it. I'm not in the privileged state that Mike is in to be able to have a budget for such things. I have good news. You don't need any of it. You don't need any of it. You can run awesome games at your table. And in many cases, the things that you can do to make your game better are things you can do for free. I talk about those a lot on this show too, and we'll talk about it a little later in the show. The things that you can do to make your game awesome are almost always free. Rarely does a purchased product make your game better. Now, there's a little bit like, do you need the core books? I mean, there's people who say they don't need the core books, that they can play with the free rules. Bob Worldbuilder had a video where he's like, you can download the SRD and play with just the SRD for free. And you can. My feeling is if you're getting a lot of value out of it, you probably put a little bit of money their way. And, looking at D&D, example, the 2024 books for D&D, it's $150 to buy all 3 books. But that's a really good investment, because you're going to be able to use those books for the rest of your life. You don't have to pay any more money forever, and you can play that. You can play with old versions of D&D that came out 50 years ago that you bought back then, or that you bought on the used market, or that you bought in PDF and stuff like that. But the reality is, anytime, this is probably the biggest message I would like to get out there in this whole conversation, is if you see me and hear me talking about cool products that are coming out in crowdfunding campaigns, and you don't have the means to afford them, or it's a stretch to be able to afford them, you can always tell yourself, this is a cool thing, but the things that I can do to make my game better, I can do for no money at all. And that's something that I think is really important. So if you don't have the means, do yourself a favor and remember that those products, A, a lot of them sit on the shelf and they don't get used anyway, and B, the things that you can do to make your game awesome, you can do for no money at all. On the other side, people like me who do buy a lot of RPG products, who have a budget for this. And I think it's actually, like, as a hobby, it's a very affordable hobby, right? There are hobbies that are way more expensive than this. And if you're talking about, picking up stuff on Humble Bundles and, that's not a lot of money for the amount of material that you're getting for these things. I talked about the Pathfinder 2 Humble Bundles, $30 for 70 products, including 5 core books, right? It's a ton of stuff for a low amount of money. If you buy that stuff and you flip through and you're like, yeah, that's cool, but you don't find yourself using it, you don't need to feel bad about that. Having a library of your own that you can sort through and sift through and grab ideas from and just let it inspire you can be enough. That you don't have to, you don't have to build a requirement that everything you buy in the RPG world you have to use at your table all the time, or none of it is useful. You can decide, no, I just like flipping through and looking at the art. I like just being inspired by reading what other creators wrote in this hobby. I have so much material. I got 90 gigabytes of PDFs for TTRPG products. There's a few in there I've never opened. I usually open at least everything at least once and kind of sift through it to see what I picked up. But not always. And again, like, I picked up that Pathfinder bundle and I only downloaded the 5 core books. I didn't download the other 65 products that are there because I don't have the time to dive through. But I really wanted those core books, and that's why I paid them. And $30 for 5 core books was a really good deal for me. So don't feel guilty. You don't need my permission. And maybe you're going to feel guilty even if I tell you not to. But you don't have to. You don't have to feel guilty about picking up products that you don't use at your table. It's totally fine to pick up products and be inspired by them and read the art and support creators at the same time. Now, here's another super valuable tip that I can give you about dealing particularly with crowdfunding campaigns. Crowdfunding campaigns have about a 10, or at least on Kickstarter. Kickstarter did some research on this, and they said that about 10% of Kickstarters failed to deliver, which means that they succeeded in getting funded, but they failed to deliver the product that they funded. So about 1 in 10 fail. That's not great. Like, if you're betting, 9 out of 10 succeed, a 10% loss rate is pretty bad. I'm going to give you a few tips right now that will make that 10% a lot smaller. I don't have any measures to say that it's going to drop it from 10 to 1% or something like that, but these things will reduce your overall failure rate on Kickstarters and backer kit things and other crowdfunding campaigns that you support. Number 1, ask yourself, have they regularly produced awesome work already? Do I know that they know this business and that they've made things before? I am highly confident, way higher than 90% confident, that the Monstrous Menagerie 2 is going to be delivered. Because one thing that EN World does is they pre-make their work. So the Monstrous Menagerie 2 is already done, and we're going to see it as soon as the campaign is over. So that's even a bad example. But in other cases, like when I see a crowdfunding campaign, my question is, have they done it before? Do they know how to do this work? Did they deliver on time? And you can go back and look at their previous Kickstarters. I'll do this for ones that I don't recognize. I'll be like, well, what else have they made? And have they delivered on those? And have there been any issues with those? That's one way. Do a little bit of research into the group that's doing the Kickstarter and look, have they done this before? Another one that I do, and I talk about it on the show all the time, is do they have a sample of their product that shows the full breadth of what the product is going to look like? A dirty trick about the sample for a crowdfunded campaign is when you show me a sample that it has a layout and has artwork in it and has been edited and has mechanics in it and was delivered to me, I know that you could probably take that 30-page sample and turn it into a 300-page sample because you've done all of the steps that are needed for that. Granted, it all has to scale up a lot bigger, but if you've managed to do layout and art and editing and delivery already, I feel more confident that you'll be able to deliver the other thing. If I'm backing a Kickstarter and there is no sample, and I don't know that they've delivered products in the past, I'm a lot less secure in knowing that they're going to actually deliver a thing because they haven't shown me that they can. One of the excuses I sometimes hear is, well, we don't have the money. The money is to help us do that stuff. My argument is, if you don't have the rest of that stuff lined up enough to do a sample, you shouldn't be asking for people's money. That's my opinion on it. Does the product seem reasonable to produce? When you look at the product that they're offering and ask yourself, do I think that they're going to be able to do this? And a lot of times, like a PDF, it's hard to screw up a PDF. And I guess it's happened. But like physical production of stuff is way harder than making a PDF. So if I look at a product and I'm like, oh, that seems cool, but wow, they got a lot of stuff that they're doing. They've got miniatures, they've got plushies, they've got dice, and they've got weird mats, and there's like a lot of stuff. And I know it's hard to make all that stuff and coordinate all that stuff when they've never done it before. Maybe I'll just back the PDF because I'm pretty sure the PDF I'm going to get. Right? Even if they fail to produce the plushies on time and the dice come out all weird, I know that the PDF will probably be okay. Then another question, of course, which is really important, is can you afford it? Right? Are you looking at this thing and do you decide, do I have the disposable income in order to back this project? And then the other question is, do I really love this idea and do I see myself using it at the table? So those last two, can you afford it? And do you really love the idea and see yourself using it? That's more about you deciding whether or not it's something you want to back or not. That doesn't help you determine whether or not the Kickstarter is going to be successful. But I think that those other questions, have they regularly produced the work? Do they deliver on time? Do they have a sample that shows the full breadth of their product? And does the product seem reasonable and that this is something that they can actually accomplish? If you ask yourself those questions on Kickstarters, I think that you would have a higher success ratio than the 90% of Kickstarter campaigns. So the two main things where I feel like people could use the help is, one, for those people who cannot afford these kind of products, you don't need to feel bad about not getting them. In fact, what you can do is wait, especially if your budget is tight, the better way to go by far is to let these things come out and see how they're used and find out which ones are really have a big benefit to it. So you might not have gotten in on the Shadow Dark Kickstarter when it first happened. I did. And actually there was a benefit to backing on a Kickstarter because I was guaranteed a copy. I actually got a copy of the main book and the special edition cover. I don't even know if you can get the special edition cover anymore. I got a lot of extra stuff for doing it. So it was a really good deal on the Kickstarter, but you can still pick up Shadow Dark today, especially if you're going digital. You can get everything digitally that was available back then as well. So if you don't have the means, you don't have to back these Kickstarters. And the reality is a lot of them are not going to make your game better. That a lot of times you're going to look at it and they're good things to help inspire you and they help support creators in the work that they're doing. But are they really going to change the game that you're running at the table? At best, often you're going to get like one or two ideas that you might be able to use. And sometimes you'll say, no, this product really does make my game better, or it made it better for this one session where I used it or something like that. There's definitely somewhere I found it. But you don't have to feel like you need to be backing these in order to run a great game. The things that make your game great are things that you can do for free. And two, you don't have to feel bad buying this stuff and not using it. You're supporting creators. You're helping the whole industry expand bigger than just one giant monolithic company or a couple of giant monolithic companies. Can there be multiple monolithic companies? I guess. You're helping a wider industry of creators take work that they've made and put it out there. And you also don't necessarily know which ones are going to change the whole industry. Could we say that Shadow Dark was going to have, kind of take over the whole OSR world? Not really, but it kind of did, right? It's a very popular RPG, and it came from a crowdfunded campaign. There's lots of games that are like that, and there's lots of stuff that we can take from games like that. So you don't have to feel bad that you don't use everything that you pick up in a crowdfunding campaign. Those, to me, are the two areas where there's a a negative aspect to crowdfunding campaigns, and I think both of those are manageable. And on the flip side of it, we are seeing a wealth of products we never would have seen before, products that are able to focus on particular aspects of the hobby that no one else is focusing on. Those big monolithic companies are not going to be able to put resources towards them, so we can watch other people doing it. There's lots of experimentation happening, lots of changes that are occurring to the hobby, and a few times where those ideas have then percolated up and shown up in bigger RPGs. So it's really making the whole hobby better. So I really love crowdfunded campaigns. I will continue to talk and promote various crowdfunded campaigns here on this show because I think it is a great way to show the whole breadth of the RPG hobby. But I wanted to make sure it was clear to you when I am promoting these things that A, if you pick them up and you don't use them, that's okay. You still got to support a creator and you still have building a library of material that you can use to fuel your imagination and give you ideas and help you change the game at your table. And two, if you are not able to afford that, it is not a problem at all. The best things that you can do to make your game fun for you and your friends are things that you can do for absolutely free. Right up front, in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. By the way, I was given a review copy of the Dungeon Master, 2 review copies of the Dungeon Master's Guide from Wizards of the Coast. And because I used to write for D&D Beyond, I have access to the Dungeon Master's Guide on D&D Beyond for free. Both of those things should be considered when you hear me talking about how awesome it is. And it is pretty awesome. It's got a lot of really good stuff in here. But one thing I think, as soon as you get past like the credits page and you get to the basics, the first page of the book, it talks about what, and I have a picture of it up here from D&D Beyond. What does a DM do? And then DM tips. And it's this DM tips section that I really wanted to dive into because it's one of the first things that the book promotes to you. And it is something that I think about a lot because I have built a 15-year hobby/business around the idea of offering DM tips. So I wanted to give you my views as somebody who has spent a tremendous amount of mental energy thinking about DM tips, studying how DMs play, diving into this world to give you an idea of what I think of the DM tips that they offer in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Right up front, I think they're pretty great. I think that these DM tips are good. And there's one reason that I think they are really fantastic tips, and that's because they are not necessarily obvious to a lot of GMs. And we're gonna dive into that. So here are the 5 main tips, the 5 tips that it offers. Embrace the shared story. It's not a competition. Be fair and flexible. Communicate with your players, and it's okay to make mistakes. 4 of those 5, I have seen DMs, both new DMs and experienced DMs, who directly go against those. They act against those. And that's why I think that these tips are really good, is because they're not just general tips that anybody, like, have fun and enjoy your time with your friends. And they're not just useless words that everybody already knew. Instead, they are arguing for a specific style of play that some GMs don't follow. And the example is embrace the shared story. This one is a really good tip because a lot of times GMs, and particularly new GMs, walk in with a story already prepared. They have a way that they want the game to go, and they write it out ahead of time, assuming the characters are going to follow a certain path. And usually for new GMs, what happens is they put it in front of them, their players do something else, and they're totally not ready and they're totally unprepared. That is a very common experience. And it's a common struggle even for veteran GMs. I have seen veteran GMs who get extremely frustrated because the players are not following through in the story that they developed ahead of time. So the embrace the shared story is a really good tip. Now, I'm not sure that the sentences where they describe it kind of say, by the way, this means you don't want to fill out the whole thing. But later in the book, it talks about that idea that, like, you are setting up situations to let the players get. It's not a competition. Again, I have seen GMs that treat it like it is a competition. And what's really interesting is this gets away from the root of what D&D used to be, which was chainmail, which was a war game, which was a competition. So I think it's important to show that, no, in this game, the GM is not there, the DM in this case, the DM is not competing against the players. You're not trying to beat them. That means you're not trying to beat them with traps. It means you're not trying to beat them with encounters. And, you are not trying to defeat them. You are setting up situations to help build a story and watch the story develop at the table. That is a really good tip. Be fair and flexible. That is the one tip that I don't think, like, I don't know that people would say, oh, you should cheat. And this one could be misconstrued a bunch of different ways. Is it cheating if you change the hit points on the fly? Is it cheating if you change a die roll, right? And some people think like, oh, never change a die roll. And other people are like, no, it's okay. Once in a while to fudge a die if it means the game is going to be more fun. So this one's an interesting one. And, it says like, hey, be fair and flexible, that your intention is not to sway too heavy in one direction or the other. This is one where I'm not sure that there is an opposite to it, but maybe there is. Maybe when we think about things like how much should you fudge, but I think like how much should you fudge and where is actually a good question. I don't think that's really talked about too much in the DMG, but that's kind of an interesting one. Communicate with your players. That you should, open communication is essential to a successful. Many problems can be solved and even prevented with honest conversation. Ask questions, solicit feedback after or between sessions. Fantastic advice. Something I have often said is that players are getting about half of what you're describing, and many times you have to stop and say, here's what's really going on. Here, players, like, let's get away from our characters. And as players, we'll talk about what's really going on in this so that you can understand. Talk to your players, break character, and talk to the players about what's going on in the game when it doesn't seem like they understand it. Really good advice that a lot of GMs say, like, oh, I figure the character should discover it. No, you can just tell them. If they're playing their character in a way you don't like, pause. Say, let's pause for a minute. Would it be, can we play it where you're not trying to rob from the other players? Or I think it would really work best if the motivation for your character was such that it matched the motivation of the other characters that you're heading in the line, instead of you trying to, go the other way. Ideally, you have that in a session 0. The Dungeon Master's Guide talks about session 0, so does the Player's Handbook. But that communication is really good. Open, out of character communication is really critical, and I think it's a really great tip that they have in here. And then the last one is, it's okay to make mistakes. And I like this one a lot because one thing that I learned, and there's actually really good data on this. So David Christ, who runs Baldman Games, I interviewed him on a show that I used to run, a podcast that I used to run called Behind the DM Screen. And I had an opportunity to interview David Christ, who has run, I think, more than 1 million games. He's run more than 1 million players, and he's run hundreds of thousands of games for decades, literally decades. And he's surveyed players on these games. So he has hundreds of thousands of surveys on these games. And in it, he would do correlations of different criteria that people brought to the game, or that GMs brought to the game, and how that correlated with the overall scoring of the game and the fun. And the one that had the least correlation with the fun of the game was rules knowledge. That being prepared for your game, being open and communicative with the players, being friendly with your players, and being prepared for that game was were better ideas than having good rules knowledge. You needed to have enough that it didn't get in the way. You needed to be prepared enough that not knowing every rule could get in the way. But the reality is, it's okay to make mistakes. You can count on the other players to help you out. You can talk to them about it, and it's not going to hurt the fun of the game. And a lot of GMs think, oh my God, I have to know every single rule. I have to know every single power. I have to know every single spell. I have to know all of this stuff or I can't run the game. And the answer is no. You can talk to your players about it. It's totally fine to pause the game for a minute and look up a rule. Don't worry about it. Not everything has to be this perfectly smooth, perfect game. It's totally fine to pause and say, let's look up that spell for a second, right? And pull out a book and look up a spell and see if it works the way you think that it works. And then you make a judgment and you move on. So rules knowledge is actually not nearly as important as people think, often as people think. So those are the 5 tips that the Game Master's Guide, the Dungeon Master 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide offers. And I think those are all really good tips. I think that it's great to have those on page 1. It is a big improvement over the previous Dungeon Master's Guide, where they started in with like how to build a pantheon and what kind of coins are you going to use in your game, and way in the deep end of the pool when it came to world building, instead of just saying like, these are the things that you really want to pick up. Now, I thought for fun is we would compare these to the top tips that I offer on Sly Flourish. There is a top tips for Dungeon Masters, top tips for Game Masters, because that I wrote a while ago. And this was based on all of the experiences that I had, feedback I got from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, talking to other GMs, surveying thousands of Game Masters, running all kinds of polls and everything, and bringing this in. I really wanted to get, like, what do I feel like are the best pieces of advice that I have learned that I can share? And you will see there is a pretty big similarity to those that we saw the Game Master, the Dungeon Master's Guide offering, and the ones that I offer. Let the story unfold at the table. Right? Like, don't build a story ahead of time. I talked right about this when we look at the other one. They say embrace the shared story. I say let the story unfold at the table. Basically the same thing. That we're saying, like, the story happens at the table. The story does not happen ahead of time. That to me is a big tip. It's my number one tip. Set up situations and let the characters navigate them is kind of what you do based on the first rule, right? If the first one is let the story unfold, well, then what do? Well, you set up the situation. You say there's going to be, the characters are involved in a heist. Their job is to steal a bribe that's being passed along to these desert bandits from the Dragon Empire, and they want to go and get it ahead of time. And it's going to happen at this big gulch, and there's going to be gnolls that come in at the last minute that they're not going to be aware there. I'm setting up, I don't know how it's going to go. Are the gnolls going to be friends or allies or enemies? I don't know. Are they going to be able to steal it? I don't know. Are they going to do something else? I don't know. I set up the situation and I see how it goes. And that's really fun. Be on the character's side. This one you could really talk about that idea of, are you being fair and flexible, right? And communicating with your players, that you're on the side of the players. This isn't a competition. They're your collaborators in the story you share. You're all working together to bring this story up. And being on the character side means keeping the spotlight and the highlight on the cool, heroic action of the characters who are being played by real people at your table. Your NPCs don't matter. No one cares about them except maybe you, and you should probably care a little less about them than you think. But the player characters have players who love them, and that's who you want to be focusing your attention on. Be on the character's side. Treat them well, put spotlights on them, show off their capabilities, set up situations that show up their capabilities. Use tools and techniques that help you prepare to improvise. This one's definitely not one that the Dungeon Master's Guide has, but you will see it all throughout the Dungeon Master's Guide. It talks about this idea of, when you're looking at the tools and the books and the tricks and the tips and the things that you use and the preparation techniques that you use to run your game, use those that help you improvise at the table. Things like having a random list of character names so that when they meet a new NPC, you can quickly come up with a name that doesn't sound stupid that you can use for that NPC. I really love like the Paizo basic flip mat because it's a big blank whiteboard I can put on the table in front of me with a wet erase marker and draw on it, and it's great, right? It's a fantastic tool. So what are the tools that you can use that help you improvise? I think are really crucial, because the tools that you use that box you into a certain style of play is going to make your game less flexible when you're actually running it. Focus on your next game. This is not advice that the Dungeon Master's Guide offers, but it's one that I have promoted now for 15 years. There's one game that matters, and that's the next one you're going to run. You don't have to plan their games 10 games out. You don't have to plan out your entire campaign. You're going to have friends coming to your table, either virtually or physically, and that's the game you should prepare for. So take the time and energy and effort that you were going to focus on great big things, and instead focus it on the cool things that you could do to set up the situations in your next game. Focus on your next game. Build your world campaign and adventures from the characters outwards. This is called spiral campaign development, right? And the idea is, just like you're focusing on your next game, you're also focusing on the characters, where they are, and what they're going to do. You don't have to build out every single part of the giant Marathi Dragon Empire. I only need to worry about the 4 or 40 fingers because that's where the characters are, and they need to worry about what's going on with the bribe that they're dealing with today. That's all I've got to worry about. I don't need to worry about all of the other machinations of the political intrigue between these different dragon lords and what they're doing. It sounds cool, and I could totally spend time doing it, and maybe if I'm bored I can go focus on that, but I shouldn't pretend that that's the stuff that's actually going to matter to the players when they sit down to play the game that I'm going to run for them today. Pay attention to pacing. Pacing is a huge issue. They don't really talk too much about pacing in the Dungeon Master's Guide that I remember, but pacing is a big issue. And how do you make sure to manage pacing? And this is things like having upward and downward beats. Good things happen and bad things happen, and good things happen and bad things happen. Oscillating between trials and benefits. Not perfectly, not one-to-one, but you want to make sure that you have a mixture of good and bad things happening all throughout to really keep the players engaged in the story. Too many good things and it becomes boring. Too many bad things and it becomes hopeless and frustrating. So how do you mix that up? But then there's other tricks we can do for pacing, like how to speed up a battle really quickly by lowering the hit points of the monster, how to end on a cliffhanger so that we have really exciting things. There's lots of ways that lots of tips for using pacing and for focusing on pacing that you can do. Focus on the fiction first and mechanics second. I call this like a fiction sandwich, right? in world while you're playing and talk about what things look like in the world first, then focus on the mechanics on how to arbitrate the situation mechanically, and then talk about what the results of that are in the world. The fiction sandwich, right? Describe first what kind of attack you're going to do and what it looks like, then roll the die to see what it does, and then describe what it looks like in the world. Though that kind of breakdown continually reminds you and the players that you're sharing a fantasy story, a fantastic story. You're not just rolling dice and doing spreadsheet work, that there's more to it. So those are the tips. Those are my top tips that I offer. I thought really hard about this. They evolve over time. But when I have new GMs that say, like, what are the top things I should do? These to me are the things that I think make our game the best. And I think all of these are things that we can dive deep into and learn even more from, like pacing, like things to help us improvise, like setting up situations, like all of those things, how to focus on the fiction. All of those things are lifelong things that we can improve on while we are working on our game. So I am both very happy to see the DM tips offered in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. I think they're really good. And I am proud to offer my own top tips for how I think game masters can really make their games awesome. And I hope you can take and learn from these tips and make your own games awesome as well. Every month on the Sly Flourish Patreon, we have the Sly Flourish Patreon Q&A. Patrons of Sly Flourish can ask me any RPG-related question. I answer every question every Friday. Some of those questions make it here to the show so that we can dive in a bit deeper. These are the first set of questions for November 2024. I'm wicked late. It's November 17th, and I'm just getting to the first questions. But I answered them all on Patreon. Bernaldo B. says, regarding what the Dungeon Master's Guide says, what is your take on players having a base? Is there a lazy base system somewhere in your books? The answer is yes. So in my upcoming book, The City of Arches, which went through a Kickstarter earlier this year, we are in the middle of working on it. I happen to have a 160-page current draft of it in layout that Scott Gray and I are working on. But one of the things we have in here, and this has been available to patrons of Sly Flourish as well, is a scenario called Secret of Summervine Villa. Secret of Summervine Villa is a scenario that lets you build your own adventures around a location and NPCs and stuff like that that's going on here. And it has in it a map. This same map was used in the Lazy DM's Companion. We love the map so much that I wanted to include it here as well. And it gives you a nice big manor with like a cool underground area. In the scenario, it's already owned by evildoers, and your job is to go break the evildoers. But one of the things that happens during the scenario, or that you can have happen to your scenario, I did it for mine, is the characters get to own it when they are done, that they are gifted Summervine Villa as their home base. And one of the things included in the City of Arches is the idea of you getting to keep the villa, that you own the villa itself. There's a cost for upkeep that we have here, and these are all just recommendations. And then there's different kinds of upgrades, and that's everything from different kind of laboratories and things that you have here, but also magical upgrades that go up to 200,000 gold pieces for a resurrection vault. And the idea is like, what are the kinds of things that you can pick up to then add and then build out in your home base? So I take a very lightweight approach to it. I think it's useful to kind of think through the economics of it. I have not looked through the Bastion chapter of the Dungeon Master's Guide. I listened to my friend Teos Abadia talk about it, and I'm pretty sure if I wanted to include something like that, I'm probably not going to include as heavy a system as it has. Instead, I'm really going to focus on the fiction of the base, them deciding what they want to do. I think it's really fun to basically hand the players a map like this one and say, you decide who goes where, who owns what rooms, what do you do with the rooms, what do you do with it? And then they get to draw on it and make their own base by drawing on it. And then you can say things like, yeah, there's an upkeep. The Level Up Advanced 5e Trials and Treasure, I think it's either Trials and Treasure or the Adventurer's Guide. I think it might be the Adventurer's Guide. It has things about hiring characters, hiring NPCs, and you basically pay for them once. And then that's assumed that they are hired for that rate for the rest of your campaign. That way you don't have to worry about paying them all the time. But you could say like, hey, for a major domo, it's going to cost this much. And you could say like, maybe it costs 500 gold to have a really experienced major domo who runs your operation while you're gone. And so you go, you get 500 gold, you pay that. And then the assumption is like, that's an escrow and it's being paid to your major domo over time so that they get their money over time, paid from an escrow that you paid up front. Really is to simplify the bookkeeping. I really like that idea. Simplifying bookkeeping is always for me a really nice one. So what kind of staff do you hire? I think the general idea that basically a trained staff person costs about 2 gold pieces a day. So you could say like, like, maybe it's 500 gold would assume that you could have a staff person that's an experienced staff person working on your place for a whole time. So you can decide like what the upkeep is on it. And then you can decide what kind of things you want to buy. And generally what I would do is tie them to like spell effects, right? Like if you want to do supernatural stuff, tie it to a spell effect and then decide how much money do you think it's worth for that spell effect to take place. And that's why I have things like Guards and Wars and Crystal Balls. I have like healing vessels and resurrection vaults. And the assumption is like this resurrection vault maybe once every week is able to resurrect somebody, but it costs you 200,000 gold to have this thing in your home. So this is all included inside the City of Arches as really kind of a loose framework for you to be able to own a home base. But that was the kind of home base approach that I like. It's one that I really like. I don't know that I need a big system for handling it. I think that abstracting it and then using it as a way for characters to be able to spend their money on things that they get to enjoy when they're between missions, I think that is a really fun way to go. John says, I really like miniatures, maps, dungeon tiles, etc. It's a nice hobby in itself to paint minis and make dioramas like Dwarven Forge stuff that you've talked about. My issue is that I think that combat is way better using the theater of the mind. I feel the players get much more immersed and focused more on the drama than the position and tactics. This bothers me slightly since I'd love to use all my miniatures and stuff. What can I do to make my minis and map combats more fun and engaging? Very good question, something that I deal with. I am going to be using a great big Dwarven Forge setup for my game today, but then I have other ones that are probably going to be theater of the mind. And that is my recommendation. Mix the types, mix the styles, that you can use big dioramas for scenes that you know are going to take place, and you can use theater of the mind for smaller battles that don't matter as much. There's definitely players who prefer to have like some kind of visual representation of what's going on, especially if they have like aphantasia and it's really hard for them to understand what's going on if they don't have a visual. That's why even just like drawing things on a piece of paper can help if you don't have anything else. Just real basic football play style diagrams of what's going on can work really well. But I would recommend mixing stuff up. A couple things you could do to make running maps and minis as dynamic as theater of the mind. A couple of tips that I would have is, one, don't worry about this grid and talk to your players about not worrying about counting every square. Instead, have them, if they say, I want, how many kind of fit in a fireball, you can like use your hands to say this many, right? You can hit all these guys with a fireball. So you can kind of abstract the square-based 5-foot grid and instead still use abstract map ideas like how many creatures can you fit into an area, or letting the fireball, because you're doing it in a compressed area, blows out further back. There's things you can do through description that you can't do just by counting squares all the time. Then the other one is talking about how they can use the environment that they can see. So what can they do with that crazy skull-lined altar that's at the top of the big cliff? Can they go up to that and then channel energy from it and then use that energy to infuse their stuff? Is it worth their time to get all the way up there to be able to draw dark magic from this old effigy that's sitting up there that's been there for who knows how many hundreds of years? Can they kick over things? Can they knock over tables? Some fun that I've had with Dwarven Forge is because it's modular, they can actually break things. They can break walls. We can move stuff around. Big cracks can appear. Things can collapse. I've set up whole areas where entire sections of a Dwarven Forge setup collapsed. So there's a lot of fun that we can do there. But my big things are mix your styles, use minis sometimes. You can always use minis and no maps. That's another trick that I don't think people use very often, which is you don't have to have any map at all. You can just have the minis on the table, and that just shows general positioning about who's where, who's behind who's engaged with what monsters are in the back, and run it like a Final Fantasy style battle where you have all the one creature on one side and the other creatures are on the other side, and they go forward and they wiggle their hands and a bunch of damage appears. I think that can work great. So there's a lot. One of the things I love about this hobby and this game in particular, 5e in particular, is there's so many different ways to run combat and so many interesting ways to make it play out that we can put all of them in our toolbox and use whichever one we think is going to be exciting for the time. So you don't have to stick to any of them. You don't need to stick to Theater of the Mind all the time. You don't need to stick to giant 3D displays with Dwarven Forge and minis all the time. You can use a mix of both, and you can try different things. Abstract maps, not counting squares, minis without maps. There's so many different ways to run it. Pieces of paper where you just draw everything out. So many different ways to play it, and they can range from a cost of 0 for a piece of paper that you stole from the local library and those little pencils that are about this big, or that you grabbed from the dog track. And you can use those and pay nothing at all. Or you can pay tens of thousands of dollars, for miniatures and Dwarven Forge terrain and everything else to build really elaborate displays. There was the Dwarven Forge display I saw that they were using for their sample that was easily, I think it was a $6,000 or $7,000 Dwarven Forge setup, and that's without miniatures. So, the sky's the limit when it comes to cost, but also there's no bottom. You can go down to zero. You're not going to make money, but you can go down to zero and run really fun dynamic battles, both with visuals or without, with piece of paper and pencil. Raphael says, do you have any post-session checklist or lazy DM activities you find useful to do just after a session or the day after? Anything that might ease the prep for the next session or foster ideas to think about between sessions? Yes. I have not solidified this into the level of rigor that the other 8 steps from Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master has. But there's a few things that help me considerably. One is writing down any names or proper nouns. So the names of mercenary companies, the names of NPCs that they've met, and just a little bit of a note to remind me who the hell those people are, because I will forget. I'll write down a name, but not remember who that was. So and I think that this is best done during the game. The minute you hear it, the minute that NPC comes out, the minute you've picked a random name, in your notes, write down the name of the NPC and who they are. Just 1 or 2 words. This is the mercenary veteran of the Silver Hands, right? So-and-so mercenary veteran of the Silver Hands. Or corrupt guard of the Silver Hands, or whatever. Write that down. So proper names are a big one. And then you're going to have to decide if that works best for you, but that definitely is something that works for me. And then the other thing that's a huge help to me is, where did the game end? What was the last thing that happened in the game? Where did it end? And if I put that in my notes, then I've got a really good, fresh way to start the next session and to start my prep for how that goes. So I really feel like those are the things that I'm finding most useful for the notes that I write. Other people have other things that they write. A lot of people do it. When you say the day after, I wouldn't do it the day after. I would do it during the game and right after the game. Write that stuff down in your notes. I'm using Obsidian. I have it on my phone, so I can do a little session notes section in my notes for that session, and I can write down proper names. I do it while they're coming up, and I can write down where did the game end, so that I'm aware of what happened last in the session. I think that can really help. Ronald B. says, I have been DMing and playing D&D for 11 years, and I think I have pretty good handle on running games, rules of cool, etc. My biggest challenge is with role-playing. I just flat out struggle with role-playing, especially when it comes to answering PC questions while trying to stay in character, let alone using a voice or accent. I practice accents, but then I chicken out. Every NPC who the PCs talk to sounds like me just answering their questions as best I can. What advice do you have to practice role-playing and stay in character during play? Number 1, Ronald, be a friend to yourself. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Be nice. Be nice to yourself. Don't beat yourself up. You're doing running games for 11 years and having a handle on all the rest of it. I bet you, I'd be surprised if your players really cared that much. I don't think they're going home saying, wow, that was a great game, except I sure wish Ronald had used a better accent for that guy. I bet you they never said that. You could talk to them about it and ask them, and maybe they're like, well, it'd be kind of fun if you did that. I don't know, but I would bet you that they're just happy to spend time with you and time with each other playing the game. If they're really that picky about it, then that's another problem, right? But first of all, be a friend to yourself. Be nice to yourself. You don't have to. That's number 1 by a long shot. The number 1 advice is just, right? Recognize your own value in just having all of the rest of this handled and not beating yourself up about not doing voices. There's nothing saying you have to. In fact, the new 2024 Player's Handbook specifically calls out, they have a demonstration of the game. They they have a list of the game. They have little side notes, which is fantastic. And they specifically talk about that some players are acting in character, other ones are not. And they show and they say those are both totally valid ways to play. And that's absolutely true from a GM perspective as well. That's number 1. Number 2, because you are saying you'd like to do stuff with this, what are some things you can do? I think my number 1 tip is listening to audiobooks. Audiobooks in particular, because they have one narrator for it, and that narrator is playing a whole lot of different characters. And those narrators, a lot of times in very subtle ways, change their own voice to speak like certain characters. They're switching genders, they're switching ages, they're switching character types. And if you can listen to them and study how they do it, right? And it's very subtle. You're probably not even listening. You probably don't even notice when you're listening. Oh, wow, he changed that to talk about a boy. Oh, he changed it to talk about a woman, right? That you can hear them change their voices to account for that stuff. And it's very subtle stuff. Very, they're not doing goofy accents. I'm listening to an audiobook right now. I'm listening to Eyes of the Dragon, which is the Stephen King book that I haven't listened to and I haven't read in decades. And I thought, I should listen to Eyes of the Dragon again. And I will say the narrator goes overboard when he's describing Flag. Now, it is a young adult novel, so it doesn't matter too much that it's going, but the narrator really, and Flag doesn't sound subtle at all. He's like, Flag is doing this thing. And you're like, wow, really? Okay. So even then, going a little bit too overboard is bad. So I would listen to audiobooks. I also have a video that I'm not going to name drop a little bit here, but back a long time ago, I did an interview with Matt Mercer talking specifically about running NPCs and doing NPC voices and stuff like that. When Critical Role, I think was, I don't know, they're still like mid-season 1 or something like that. And he gave a lot of advice in there. So I will link to that in the show notes so you can hear the advice that he has for it. One of the things he offered up, and I don't know if the site is still around, but there was a site where you could listen to accents all over the world. The tricky bit is it's very easy to go stereotyping with accents. So I would worry about accents. I don't think I'd throw many accents in there. The Scottish dwarf trope is just too much, right? So I would worry less about getting accents right. But I think that audiobooks can be a really good source for that. Friends, I want to thank all of you for hanging out with me today while we talked about tabletop role-playing games. It is a great joy of mine to talk about this with you. If you enjoyed this show and you want more stuff like this from me, the best way to get it is to subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. There is a link in the show notes. It is absolutely free to sign up. You'll get a weekly RPG-related email sent to your inbox with links, with an article about TTRPGs and links to all of the other work that I do. And you'll get a free adventure generator PDF for signing up. You can also support me directly on Patreon. It's a very reasonable price. There are 2 tiers, the hero tier and the veteran tier. The hero tier so the veteran tier gets all kinds of, both tiers get all kinds of exclusive stuff, tools, tips, tricks, ways to run your games, lots of stuff they get. The hero tier also includes another weekly podcast called Readings and Reflections, where I read the latest Sly Flourish article and then give a commentary on where it came from and some other background stuff that you might be interested in. And they're also getting access to the new City of Arches adventure scenario path for the Key of Worlds. I've got 2 of those up. There's a 3rd one that's coming out this week. That's really good. And of course, you can pick up any of my books at the Sly Flourish bookstore, including Forge of Foes, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, Lazy DM's Companion, and the Fantastic books, and lots of other books over on the Sly Flourish bookstore. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.